Okay, so today we're going to talk about the context API in React. And I've got a little sample app written here. It's super simple. It's only 3 components, really. It has my app component, which is, of course, my whole thing here. And then it has 2 pages, essentially. They're really 2 components. I call them pages, but they're just components. The first component is this login page, which is a component that takes up the whole page. So I've got this one inside my app, and it has inside it a form, but it's also got a counter inside it. Anybody not seen counters before, not quite sure how they work, not in lectures anyplace. So we've kind of seen counters before. They're the most versatile thing. We can count on counters. Okay, so there's a counter inside my login page. Nothing exciting. It's really simple. And there it is. There's my app, has a login, which has, of course, a form in it. And inside my login, I have this component called counter. Great. That's it. That's my whole app. I have another form of my app. If I log something in, if I just type in any username, click on login, it shows a different component. It shows this part down here, an info page. I've got these 2 pages called login and info, but really, if you look at my component, they're just components in my app, aren't they? And they're controlled using our old friend conditional rendering. And it checks if this auth variable here is set to true, it will show this info page. If that auth state variable is set to false, it will show my login page. It's kind of a really cheap way of doing React Router, because if you only got a few pages, why would I load a React Router? React Router is great for a bunch of pages, but for like 2 or 3 pages, for me, I just use this toggle thing. It's easy. Okay, so there's my app, and in each of my pages, I have a counter. So back to here, in my login page, I have this counter, and in my info page, I have a counter too. Okay, and we log out. You notice it's not the same counter. So if I go here to 6 in this counter and I log in, I want to see 6 here too. I want this state to be shared between my 2 components. In my app.js, I have info and login. I want there to be a counter that is shared between these 2 components. That's what I really, really want, don't I? Okay. So what I could do, I could perhaps maybe make it a custom hook. We'll try that. Let's make a custom hook for our counter and see if that solves my problem. Okay, because otherwise what I'd have to do is I'd have to actually put my count up in the app, wouldn't I? I'd have to put the count here and then pass all the functions for the counter needed, increment, decrement, and clear. That could get really, really annoying really fast, wouldn't it? So I'd only be passing all my counter functions down through my login just so I can access that counter. So let's try one thing. Let's go ahead and make ourselves a custom hook. Maybe that'll solve our problem. So let's go to new folder and we'll go hooks. There, hooks. Okay. Now we know making a custom hook was just a page. I will call it use counter. So make a custom hook called use. Oops. There we go. New file. There. Use counter.js inside hooks. Great. Now we know the custom hooks by now are super simple, unless it's a use visual mode hook, which case it's not. But in general, hooks are pretty simple. Either a function, and we'll call it use counter. And we're going to have all these functions. So right now, inside our app.js, there's inside login. Let's go to login. We'll find our counter. Pages, there we go. There's our info page, and we have this. We have our counter right there. Let's go inside our counter. By the way, cool shortcut. If you go control click on a component right here, inside VS Code, control click, it will take you to that component, which is really cool. Saves you having to go searching for the component. So from app, I can go control click on info. I'm an info. I can control click on counter. Really, yeah, really cool shortcut. That saves you lots of search. Where's that file, man? So it does save a lot of hunting around, doesn't it? Okay, and there's my counter. No surprise, it's got the really typical plus minus. I'm gonna make the actually more of a logical order. Let's put the minus on the left. I was told my order was incorrect. There we go. Plus, minus, 0, plus. Minus, 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 0, plus. There we go. Looks great. Okay. So let's take the logic out of this counter, because that's what custom hooks do. The custom hooks extract logic out of components. Just take that logic right out of there and put it right inside here, just like that. Okay. And we'll do our good old VS Code trick of auto import, which I just love. Great. Okay. So there is pretty much the logic for our counter right away. So all that I need to do is do two things. I need to export my custom hook. So I'm going to export default our use counter. There. So I can use it someplace else. And I have a use counter of my hook, but my hook doesn't return anything, does it? So this hook is not very useful. It does have all the logic. I need to expose that logic, don't I? And how do I do that? Well, I'm probably going to return, we know we have a choice. We can return objects or arrays. I'm going to return an object this time, which contains the things I want people to be able to use. So really, I want them to see the counter, so I'm going to return the counter for sure. I'm going to return the counter. I'm probably going to return my functions too, because I want people to be able to use all this. And clear. Great. So now I'm returning. So now I've got a custom hook. So let's see if this is better. So I have a custom hook that lets me do stuff. Okay. Let's take a look. Let's go ahead and we can now probably extract our logic from our counter and put it in a custom hook instead. Let's go to our counter. There. So now we don't need to have this logic in here, do we? Instead, we can simply use our logic inside here. Okay. So go ahead and let's do this. Go ahead and do this. So const and we call it counter or count. Let's take a look. We called it counter. So counter and increment, decrement, and clear. Okay, so this finds and equals our, oh, needs to be an object, doesn't it? There. And we're going to call use counter. Will it auto import? It does. I like that. Okay. No use state needed anymore. Cool. So now we have use counter. Oh, and unexpected token. Where's my unexpected token in counter.js? Oh, I must have a missing brace. Let's take a look. Return, return, return. And line 4. Oh, you're right. Hold on. I deleted too many things. Hold on. Export default. Come on. Where am I? Oh, of course. There. That's better. Okay. And use counter. Got to import my use counter. So let's grab this, and I'll do my usual trick. Control space lets us do an auto import. Great. Okay. So now I've got a custom hook that takes out the logic of all my counters and puts it in one place. So I've got this state inside this custom hook. Let's take a look. So it still works. Oh, thank goodness. So plus, 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 0, minus, okay. Working great. Let's take a look. So now let's go to our other counter in our other page, and hopefully, when it's not, it's a separate counter still. So as we know from our custom hook selector that multiple instances of a custom hook do not share state. They're still their own state. The state still lives with the component that called the custom hook. So we need to do something else. Okay, so this is not going to work. There's a trick though. We can do something a little bit different. Instead of using a custom hook, we can use what's called a context provider instead. Looks a lot like a custom hook, like really similar. And I'll show you how they look. So we can go to our custom hook because we can actually turn this into a provider instead. In fact, I can actually just copy this file. I'm going to make a new folder called providers. You'll commonly see it called that. Providers. Why? I guess they couldn't think of a better name for it. And I'm going to make a file. In fact, I can actually copy this file because it's really similar. And I'm going to call this, instead of use counter, I'm going to call it counter provider. And it's got a capital C for counter. We're going to find out why in a second. So I've got counter providers. Let's go ahead and call this counter provider there, and we'll export our counter provider. All right. So we're going to do the same thing. So there's our state. So far, so good. We've got our functions. That's okay. The only difference is that this is no longer a custom hook function. This, in fact, is a component. So as we know, components don't return just objects. What do React components return? What does a React component always return? I'll take caller number 3, JSX. I guess that was caller number 2. Yes, they return JSX. So we can turn this into a component, and I'll show you why in a second. So we're going to return some JSX. So let's just make this some data. We'll const data just for now equals, because we need this. Or data, I hate data. It's such a generic name. We'll call it provider. It is called provider data, but it's what we want to expose to the outside world. We still want to expose these things. So anyone who uses our provider still has access to all these things, the state and these things. So now let's return some JSX. Okay. Oops. There we go. Okay, so this is what I'm going to return. This is a little tricky, but it is the following thing. One thing we have to do to make this work, we have to build what's called a context. Context API. We build these things called contexts. Contexts are, well, actually context, they're oh yeah, can't think of a better word than context. They're what your components live inside. It's the context of your components. I guess it's they're like a wrapper. You can say all these components, they live inside the context of this context. So it is really just a state of affairs, or how things look to the world to these components. And it's called a context. So we have to make a context. So the first thing we do, we can do this outside of our component. We just have to make one. So we go const. It can be called anything. We're going to call it the counter context. So counter context equals, and we use a function that's built into React, and it's called create context. So it's pretty straightforward. We're going to use create context, and I want to import that. So take a look there. So just like use state, use effect, it is one of the built-in React functions called create context. So now I have a context. Okay. And I could probably export that thing because I want it to be available to everywhere in my application. So I'm going to build a context that is exportable to all of my components. Okay. Now I can go ahead and use that context here. I say counter context. dot provider. So every context in React has an element or a value with the key of provider. And this is a component. It's a built-in component to every context. So you can use that with pointy brackets, just the same. So dot provider. And it is a component just like that. Looks a little odd. You might not be used to seeing it this way, but that's exactly how it works. We could have done this too. We could have just simply said const provider equals, and then make it equal to this. Would have worked the same way. That, and then simply said this also works. But it doesn't really save us much, so I kind of left it that way. So let's leave it this way. But this also works as well. Then it's kind of a more typical way to be seeing pointy brackets. But really, this is what we're actually doing. There. Okay. Now, I'm going to use this provider component that is built into context, and it takes one prop. It takes what's called value equals. And what that is whatever you want the rest of the world to see, you pass as that value. So I'm going to pass that object or this provider data. So equals my provider data. Oops. There and there with curly braces. Do it again. Curly braces. Come on. Curly braces. Third time's a charm. Okay. There. So some minor changes to a custom hook. For the most part, the body's all the same. All the stuff didn't change. I just, instead of returning that object, I set it to some data as part of an attribute or a prop in this really magical provider context. By the way, this code here never changes when you build one of these things. So you can use this as a template, and this stuff here literally never changes. So this part never changes. The name might change, but that's about it. But from here down, this is boilerplate. There's only one more thing we need to do with our provider to make it work. We want to be able to do the following thing. This is the reason we're doing this. What we want to do is to be able to wrap things in this provider. So what I want to do is I want to wrap my application or these two components in my provider so they all have access to my state. And the way I do that is by doing this. Context provider. Is it there? Did I export it? Let's take a look. Oh, let's take a look. Thought I did. Go counter provider. Yes, of course. I call it counter provider. All right, let's go. Counter provider. Counter provider. There we go. So I want to have that there. And I want to wrap the whole thing in this counter provider. That's why it's called a context, because now these components, my app and my login, are now wrapped inside this counter provider. Okay. Now nothing's showing. Made a mistake, haven't I? Now it's all disappeared. Why? Well, let's look at what's happening. I have counter provider. That's my component. What does counter provider actually render? Let's take a look. Renders nothing. This doesn't render anything. There's nothing happening here. I need to put stuff inside here. So if I said hello inside here, I'd render hello. So this is now the part, because this provider is now my component. But I still want to render what is inside counter provider. Anybody remember from the, I think the first React lecture? How can we do that? How can we render what is inside or the content of a component? Yes, props.children. That's exactly right. We can do that. We can render props.children. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's just put inside our counter provider, we'll just render props.children. Nothing else. Just say props.children right in here. Props.children, which of course won't work because pointy brackets. So let's do that. Let's see what happens. There. And oh, not defined. Component, it needs props. Okay. And all's forgiven, everything comes back. We're all happy again. Great, so now it is exactly the same. There's no difference. So this is all working the same way, no difference. And I still haven't done anything here. These are still separate counters. So what's the point? Well, now the really cool thing is that in my counter, I go to my counter now, instead of my counter having its own state or its own hook, I can now simply tell my counter to use that context. So we went through how to build a context. It's a bit of work. We got to, set your stuff, expose it, and then do that. It's not bad, really. There's your state. There's my functions that operate on state. And I'm going to expose that to the outside world by going value equals. And that's boilerplate. So it's not bad, but it's a bit of work. But once it's done, it's done. Now we can use it. Using it is way easier. That's how we do it. We want to import. So we're going to import our counter, everything, we want to use it. So instead of saying use counter, I'm going to use a different hook, and it's called use context. So the first thing I need to do is to import that context that I built. So I'm going to go import my counter context. Oops. Counter context. Curly brace there. From providers, autocomplete, slash, there we go. I love autocomplete. So counter context. And then I use another React hook, which is called use context. Very powerful. So this pretty much stays the same. Use context. And what context am I going to use? Well, I'm going to use the counter context right there, just like that. And let's use context. Let's go ahead and auto import that. There. Okay. Don't need our hook anymore. Great. That was simple. So using a context is dirt simple. There. Seems almost too easy to be true. Let's take a look now. Well, my counter's still working, isn't it? So nothing's gone wrong. Let's take a look. Let's log in now. It's still 7. So now I am sharing state between these components. Now let's take a look how that works. If you notice, let's go to that. There. I should go back to README. Let's look at our structure. We have app and login and counter. Now, normally we would have to pass all that state all the way down. We have to have count here, wouldn't we? We'd have to have a const count equals use state here, because that's the topmost parent where that state is shared. And we've always said, put your state at the lowest parent where everything is shared. And here it's app, because this counter and this counter go through info and login to app. So I would have to have this state in app, which means I got to pass count and increment and decrement and clear to login. And then login or info would have to then pass all that stuff to counter. Really tedious. And what's the point? There's no reason that info needs to have increment or count. It doesn't need it. It simply needs to pass it along. So we're going to bypass all that. Now counter can go directly and get the state itself. What happens is anything that's wrapped in counter provider has access to this context. It's all children, all its children, all the way down. No matter how deep I go, any component can do this, that, and it's automatically got that state. No matter where it is in the tree, doesn't matter. It doesn't have to get it from its parents anymore. It simply does use context, which is really, really powerful. That means you can make components side by side, because clearly these two components are not in the same hierarchy even, right? Actually, counter is spelled wrong. There, okay. They're in sibling components. Doesn't matter because they are all wrapped inside this provider, which means every component all the way down has access to this provider. Now, clearly, I'm not using it in my info. There is no reference anywhere to count or increment, other than, of course, importing the count component, but the increment, decrement, and count. So it's really passing invisibly through all these components. If I had more on top of this, maybe I had something else. Maybe I had another parent on top of that. Who knows? There. We'll call it other component, for lack of a better name. There. Doesn't matter. Counter would still have access to this context simply by doing get the provider and then use it, which is great. So it's very powerful and it does work. So if I go plus again, I log out, it's still 11. It is truly shared state. It's like the Minerva or the the ultimate goal of doing coding, shared state. And you notice now my counter doesn't have any props, does it? There's no props. And my info, of course, has other props, but doesn't need to have props. And it's certainly not passing any props down to counter, but it's still sharing state. So this is pretty cool. Any questions so far? I know it sounds too good to be true, but it really is a fantastic way to share state. And if you're thinking of using React Router, you need context because you may have discovered under some situations, it is actually quite difficult to pass props to a route. It's like, oh, wait a second. How do I pass props to this route? There's no place to do it. Yeah, it's hard in some cases. We use context, which means we simply wrap things in here and they're available. Now, there's one interesting thing. If something is not wrapped, it doesn't have access to this. So my counter, it is wrapped inside my provider because its parent was wrapped. So it is also wrapped. But if it's not wrapped, so let's go ahead and do this. Let's go and not wrap the login there. Is that going to work? That should work. So now, so the login's wrapped, but the info is not wrapped in the provider. And this is the common mistake you see when doing use context. So this is what's for. There's the context fine. There's its state. Looks great. Let's do a login. And you're going to get this really unhelpful message from React. Object, bracket, bracket, dot, dot, something is not defined. It kind of gives you a clue. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, I can't even tell. It looks like something's wrong with my use context. That's kind of the only clue I got. And that's true because it can't use that context. It's not available to it. So because inside my counter that was inside info, the counter inside info tried to do use context, but it's not in context. It's out of context. It's taken out of context. That's really bad, I know. So, okay. There's no context. It's context free. It's an no, it's the Monty Python. Okay, so I have to wrap things in my context. And it all works. Let's try it again. I log in, and now it's wrapped. It has access to context. Fantastic. So it's not that complicated. It's fairly simple. All you do is you build yourself a provider for whatever state it is you want to share. And you can have multiple contexts in an application. I don't have to have one. Here, I'm just got a counter context, just for fun. I can have another context. In fact, let's go ahead and do that. Let's try that. Let's now, following thing. Right now, I've got this app.js. And you notice I've got this login component and info components, and I'm passing them all this stuff. I've got my auth and my user and my, a function to log in and log out. This is state, isn't it? This is authentication state. And that's just kind of messy. I don't feel like passing all that stuff down the tree. What if I wanted someplace remotely in my application to know who the current user was? Well, I would have to pass this user all the way down. So let's say, just for fun, I wanted my counter to know what the user was. So I'd have to Let's put it right. Let's put it here. I have to put the current user, right? I need a prop, so I got to have a prop. I have to have props.user, props.user, props.user. Of course, now I have to, of course, give, oh, put it inside here instead there. Of course, now I have to give that user to my counter. Okay, here we go. Let's put it in the info. We'll pass user equals props.user, props.user. Okay, and curly braces. Okay, let's take a look. So let's go to our info page. Oh, and user, hold on, take a look. Try again. Probably got a bug. Let's take a look. Where's my counter? Props, props, props. Info, user equals. Take a look. My passing props. There's my props, my user. Props user. Show app page. Let's take a look. Not gonna beat it too much. Anyway, I'd have to do it. I have to pass this user down all the way to counter, and if so, counter could use it, and then use this this user. So don't feel like doing that. Instead, I can use a context. So why don't I go ahead and in my info, let's take a user out of here. There. Okay. Make sure it still works. I'm gonna break my code. Okay. Let's do something else. Let's share our user information across our entire application. So every component, no matter where they are, will have access to the current user. A pretty common use case, right? So let's do that. Let's make ourselves a provider. It would be pretty much the same thing, wouldn't it? It'd be an authentication provider. So let's go make ourselves a provider again. So provider, there. New file, we'll call it an auth provider. And this is actually very common to build. These things are very useful. Provider. Actually, it's going to be capital A.js. Okay. So I'm going to copy my old one because they look almost the same. There's my auth provider. There. Just rename it. So I'll call that auth context. Auth context. And auth provider. Okay. Didn't break anything, did I? Nope. Okay. Great. So I'm going to be sharing all the same things that my other app had, because right now all of my auth stuff is in my app. So I'm going to take this stuff, all that logic for managing users, log in, log out, and the current user. Let me just take all that stuff and put that inside my new provider. I don't need counters. I'm going to move all that counter stuff out of here. There. Don't need that. And I'm not going to expose these anymore. There. So there's a pretty bare bones provider. Literally doesn't do anything. So I'll just take that and I'll put my stuff right there. Seemed to work. And I'm going to expose auth, expose all the stuff. I'll expose the current user. Maybe I'll expose the login function, and I'll expose the logout function so people can use it or not. It's an object, so they can decide to use it if they don't feel like it. They don't have to. So great. I think I'm done. That was it. Export that. It's called provider. So I gotta rename the actual component, don't I? Oh, wrong one. I did the wrong one. Yikes. Hold on. There. Okay. This goes inside this one. Whew. Okay. Delete that. Delete that. Okay. There. All right. And we'll grab it from our app again. These are easy to build. So, right there. And so we'll expose once again our auth, our user, log in and log out. There. Now we're done. Whew. All right. Not hard to do. Once again, This is all boilerplate. We don't touch this stuff. It's not much to touch. Props.children wrapped within our provider. Okay. But now I've got an auth context, which I can use pretty much everywhere. So now why don't I go into one of my counters and just for fun, see if a counter can actually display the current user. Why not? Okay. Let's go into our counter. And let's make another div for this because it's getting kind of awkward. Just do a fragment there. There. And now we can put the current user. So why don't I grab the current user? There. So I'm going to get the context. So auth context. Auth context equals my auth provider. Okay. So far, so good. Didn't break, so must have imported okay. And let's go ahead and use this context. So we're going to use just the user. That's all we care about. And we're going to use our auth context. See what happens. And we get the typical unhelpful something object is undefined. Why? Because we didn't wrap anything in our context, did we? So this would have worked, but we can't do it yet because nowhere did we wrap anything in auth context. So I can choose any place down the tree. I could wrap it here, I suppose, here, but I kind of want to have all my counters wrapped. So why don't I wrap the whole thing in this context? I could wrap the whole app if I want. I mean, there's no reason I couldn't do that. Even do this. I could go auth context and really wrap my audio context. Wow. Auth context. There. I could wrap the entire app in an auth context with a capital A. Hold on. There. Let's do an auto import. There. Did it import? Capital A. Doesn't make any sense. There. Okay. And let's put the outside here. I'm doing this for effect. This is not what I actually do. So auth context. And end our pointy bracket here. Okay. Okay. It is not exported. Okay. Where is our provider? Auth provider. Export auth provider. Providers of auth provider. Let's make sure. Auth context is not provided. So auth context. Context. Auth context. Oh yes, of course. We're in our app.js. So auth context. Oh, auth provider. Of course. Auth provider. That's why. There we go. And we'll auto import that just for fun. There. There we go. Okay. We don't need our context here. We're not using it yet. I'll leave there for now. Okay. So there we go. Let's see if I can log in and then get the current user. Let's take a look. Well, it's not crashing on me. It's not bad. So now let's go to my counter. So now let's go ahead and put the current user. This is now not failing, by the way. I'm working great. I've got the user. Nothing crashed. So let's go ahead and put the username. Dot. Was it name? I think it was name. There. Oh. All right. And hold on. User, use context, auth context. Let's take a look. Make sure we're exposing. Are we exposing the right stuff? Let's take a look at our auth context. I'm going off script here. So auth user, provider data. Let's take a look. Oh, of course. Yes, it is undefined. Let's do one more thing. I went off script a bit. So, of course, in my app.js, I'm actually setting up all my state. So this is the login I'm handling right now, isn't it? So what I should do before I start messing with the counter, there we go. Now I'm going to use in my app.js, I'm going to use my provider. So I've now taken all my auth context or logic and put it inside this auth provider, which is right here. So now I can use that. So in my app.js, I really want to do the same thing. I want to grab the auth provider like this. So I want to grab that. And I want to grab the auth context right here. So really, it's like the same thing, my context and my provider. That's what I want to use, is my auth provider and my auth context. So hold on, it should be a small a there. Okay. And I want to use that context. So much like in my counter, I can say use auth context inside my app.js. And I can get things like login, logout, auth, and user. So I could say const, well, it's copied from counter. Did it already, didn't we? Well, did most of it. In fact, I can do it from here. There. So we'll go const that thing equals use context of our auth provider. Oh, auth context. Come on. Okay. So let's take a look. And of course, I've got these duplicates. Get rid of all this stuff. Okay. And I should get the, not defined again, the same error. Why? Why? This keep happening to me. Well, because I've wrapped all my stuff, haven't I? I've wrapped auth provider. So why am I getting this error on my use context? Well, you may have guessed that turns out that I have in fact wrapped everything, but I haven't wrapped everything, have I? What's missing? What haven't I wrapped in this auth provider that stops me from doing this? Because clearly everything is wrapped. I've got div. Yeah, app. That's right. App is not wrapped. So this is actually outside of this auth provider. So I can't do this here. I got a bit of a problem, don't I? How can I fix that? How can I make it so I wrap even my app.js in my auth provider? Is there a way I can do this? Wrap an index? That sounds promising, yeah. That's not a bad, let's just take this and instead, why don't we go into a file that we rarely look at? It's called index.js. Oh, look, there's app. Why don't I simply do this? Why not wrap app in my auth provider? Just like this. There. There. And of course, it's not liking the comma there, so I got to do this there. There we go. And, oh, parent element, I've got one, hold on. Missing a parent element here. Auth provider, oh, of course, there. All right. Whew. Who is this? There was a P.T. Barnum, never do live shows with children and animals. Or I guess apparently context providers as well. So, okay. So far so good. I'm wrapping now everything inside my auth provider. So now I should be able to go inside my app and use my use context. So I need to get my use context back. So I'm going to import. I'll just go import my auth provider. From providers / auth provider. There. Great. Okay. Oh, context. Add. There. Okay. Any happy yet? Okay, and auth provider defined. Hold on. Auth provider, providers, auth provider. Seriously? Oh, of course. There and there. Okay. Whew. Okay. That's what happens when you go off script. Okay, there we go. So we have now wrapped the entire application in this auth provider by kind of hacking our index.js, which is acceptable. Remember, you've got this, you probably see strict mode. They do exactly the same thing. Strict mode is another kind of special thing that looks like a component, but it's not, that you wrap things in. You can wrap as much as you want. So it's perfectly fine to use index.js, but now every single component in my application has access to all this stuff. So hopefully I should be able to access anything. Let's take a look. And it worked. Log in, log out. Let's go to app.js. So now these functions are working. And this is now shared state. When I log in, it works the same way. Log in, that worked. Log out. So apparently everything's working. I should now, presumably, if I haven't done anything else wrong, is now, use context and try to get the user. Okay, let's see if we can make this finally work. So user dot name, please work. Oh, hold on. User is no. Okay. We'll ignore that one for now. So let's take a look. Auth context provider. I'm probably got a user and, oh yeah, good point. I could do that. User and username. That might actually work because I think I've got it. It's actually null in some cases. So yeah. So yeah, actually makes sense. Let's try that. Let's go put user not equal to, let's go to user and user dot name. Yeah, I'll try that one. I'm trying to be too clever, I know. So, oh, didn't crash that time. It might not work. Oh, it worked. There we go. Awesome suggestion, man. So there we go. So now clearly I've now made this counter component, which is buried pretty deep in my app now, isn't it? It's all the way down here, but is now directly accessing user without any props at all. In fact, there's no props, which is pretty cool. So now every component in my application has access to the current user, which is a great thing because you want to put maybe the nav bar or something else. So almost seems too good to be true, doesn't it? Are there any downsides to doing it this way? Because we know that there's this library called Redux. Has anybody, by the way, looked at Redux as an option for their final project? Anyone? Anyone looked at Redux? Anyone just scared to look at Redux because it looks so intimidating? Yeah. So Redux does something similar. It's, of course, much bigger than this. It is a really true state management. Context API, which is quite new. It has been commonly said that really almost makes Redux unnecessary. I wouldn't go as far as say it makes it obsolete or unneeded, but it's certainly for medium and small applications. Context API is great, and you don't need Redux for these because you can just do 2 lines. Use context or get the context and use it. And that's it. So get your context, use your context, and you can use whatever you want. I'm using user here. Super simple. Redux is much bigger. And the reason we still use Redux is because for large applications, it starts to become a problem if you've got tens of thousands of components all that need to render each other all at the same time. Because as we know, when one component renders, so when login renders, it will re-render, and it will re-render all of its children beneath it. So right now I have state because a state triggers a re-render. So if state changes, any component that contains that state will also re-render. So counter provider, it's a component. It contains, control click, the state, doesn't it? So if this count changes, that means my counter provider is going to re-render and all of its children beneath it are going to re-render. Now, not a big deal, right? But now my app is wrapped in auth provider. So if auth provider changes, and it does because I log out, change the state, now it will re-render and app will re-render and every child of app will also re-render. Now for a small application, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter at all. Because we know that rendering is so cheap, it's so inexpensive as to be almost negligible. So for tens, 20, 30,000 objects, not a problem. Because we know that rendering, doing a React render, which is just running functions, the time it takes to do one update of the DOM of the real DOM. So typing that R, the DOM changed, the real DOM changed. The time it took to do that, I could have rendered 30,000 objects in React. So they're cheap. So there's not much consequence to it. It becomes an issue if you have really large applications with many dependent components that could re-render each other and trigger cascading renders and all kinds of things. Then it finally settles down. Then it becomes an issue. Then something like Redux does become more useful because it can do selective renders of only the component that needed the state and leave the rest alone. Whereas Context API is a bit of a bigger stick. It's really putting all your state just in the parent, and then it's sharing it among the children, but it's just passing it down invisibly to all the children instead of passing it down through props. So what should you use? Seriously, for the first quite a few years of your life, Context API is the way to go. But you may go to work for a company that uses Redux and you learn it. It's pretty cool. It's a really cool library, but it's a lot bigger and takes a bit of getting used to. So, but for finals, if you're going to do state sharing, this is the one you want to use. You want to use contexts and make providers for your state. All right, well, that's pretty much the end of today's discussion. Any questions on this one? I will give you the source code, and as I almost always do, let's take this. I break it down into a bunch of branches. So I start, kind of go through all the different incarnations of this, of how I built this thing. Starting with a clean app, I start with the login app, which is on right now. Then I build a hook, then I build a counter, then I build another hook, all the way. Okay, and just for fun, I'll look at the end game, which is right in here. Let's undo that. There, let's go to our branch here. Oh, come on. Well, this always changes. There. And we're going to go here. Let's go to here. I built another provider just for fun. I called it state provider. It has a complex state in it. That's kind of cool. Much like you have in a more real life application. And I exposed some functions here. Very similar. Now put the counter embedded. I can have other state. So you don't just have to make one provider for one item. You can have multiple states inside your provider, as long as they're logically connected to each other, and then expose whatever functions. I've got these, but I can have some more functions that need some other stuff for my state. A little more complex example of the same thing, but it works exactly the same. So I do encourage you to, I'll post the link to this, to grab this, look at the various incarnations. There's our first counter, and there's our auth provider, and there's like a state. And this one, of course, is a simplified version. So, okay, let everyone go. Have a great afternoon. Good luck with finals.
I had a question, Gary.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Oh, I see your hand. Sorry, my mistake. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's all good. I'm just wondering, like, my group has kind of like already set up our front end and started passing things like I've got user on almost every component already. Is it worth it to refactor at this stage, do you think?
It's not hard. It really isn't hard. And making these providers is pretty simple. I mean, it's not hard to make a provider. Where we go here? There.
Yeah, it doesn't seem hard to make it. I'm just wondering if like
pretty simple.
Deleting everything and refactoring all that might be still worth it.
It depends if you're going to add more stuff and have more components and realize, oh, this component is user as well. Maybe I should. It's up to you. Right. It's more complex passing all the props. The nice thing is you can build a provider all by itself because this doesn't eliminate your props. You can still have all your props. Go ahead and build the provider and have one and try with one component and see if you can actually share state. So you can still use this. Of course, it won't be the same state as your prop state, but you can certainly try it. and then see if it works with one component. It's up to you. It'll
Yeah.
become an issue if you start to have, you're adding more components that also need that user. Then you got to, of course, pass the props all the way down. It's up to you. I mean, don't go ripping your stuff apart too much because you have to get your final done. But this is a very useful way. For example, in this auth provider, this would probably be a login. This would probably be a database lookup, wouldn't it? It'd be go to the database, compare the password, come back with a true, and then set the auth to true, right? And the logout would be the same thing. We'll just clear the login. Or this could be a Firebase lookup now. Now it's abstracted away. So this real login is right now it's the world's dumbest login. It just accepts anybody, right? So there. But it could be an OAuth 2 login, which does sends a API call. So it keeps it nice and abstracted as a provider. So you don't need to worry about the implementation. You simply call login from anywhere you want or log out. That's kind of a design choice. So don't spend too much time on it, but it really makes your code much simpler. Because as you can see, my counter has no props. And my info didn't need props at all. So literally there's no props. Like there's no props in info. Where's my login? No props in login. This is a prop-free application. There's no props. The only thing that has props is my provider, right? And that's it. My counter has no props. My pages, all my components, they have no props at all. So just give it a try. If you don't want to do too much, leave it the way it is. All right.
Okay. Thanks.
Hey guys. All right. Let everyone go. Good luck with finals, everyone. We're talking again soon. All right. See you, everyone.